under the direction of Eldred Stevens. He's labored in local work in Texas, Kansas, Missouri, Oklahoma, and Arkansas. He's preached in over 20 states and in 6 foreign countries, in Costa Rica, in Latvia, in Mexico, Taiwan, Ukraine, and Zambia. He has served as an instructor in other schools of preaching and as the director of the Kiev School of Preaching in Kiev, Ukraine. He currently serves as an instructor for the Online Academy of Biblical Studies. He's authored several books and tracts. He spent some time in Kansas City, Kansas, locally, and that's when we had the opportunity to become very close with him and his family, and we're thankful that he is here as part of this lectureship this year, and we look forward to the lesson that he will bring to us on John Mark.
Several years ago, it was my privilege to go up to the hospital to visit a man named Dallas Wilmoth. He's since passed from this life. He was a great Christian. He worked for the Lord very diligently, and he told me while he was laying there in that hospital bed, he said, "I just can't sleep." And I said, "Dallas, I can help you out a little bit." And Dallas said, without a quip, he said, "What are you going to do, preach to me?" Well, it seems like that's my job right at this moment. To put you to sleep. Or maybe to preach to you. It would be amiss on my part if I didn't express my appreciation to this congregation. This congregation means so much to me and to my family, and the various things that it has helped us with over the years. But also, I think really goes back to, a lot of it is back to the Midwest Lectures. It has been a great influence on my life, and I look forward to it each year. It is a great highlight of the year, and it is a great pick-me-up. And I don't remember what speaker said this, but somebody said, it's every once in a while, every few years, I don't know about that, I think it's every Monday, that you have a bad day and you need a little pick-me-up. Well, this always helps. And, I take advantage of the recordings of it as well. Whenever I leave here, I'll get the recordings off the internet, stick it on a little jump drive, and stick it into my dash on my pickup, and back and forth to school, I'll listen to the various speakers, and most of the time, although there's one or two that I just can't hardly stomach listening to again, Jesse. But most of them, no, not most, all. But anyway, I enjoy listening to them a second time and sometimes even a third time. And so it's a great opportunity, and it's a real pick-me-up. And I do appreciate so much the 39th Street Church, the elders, her minister, as well as the ladies that fix dinner. I mean, it's a lot of work, and I know that it's a lot of work. But we do appreciate it. And of course, I also appreciate the Online Academy of Biblical Studies that provide the opportunity to broadcast it live, but more than just that, because I believe there's probably more that listen to it afterwards, listen to the recordings of it, than they do the actual live broadcast of it. And so I do appreciate that. And like I said, I just download them and put them on a jump drive and listen to them in my pickup as I drive here and there. Now, I might make mention of this. Many people have asked and about my eye. My right eye, I had surgery on it last December, then had a second surgery in I think January, and then had a third surgery about 5 weeks ago. And what I usually tell folks is this: if I close my right eye, I'm not winking at you. I'm just trying to focus. And I have to close that right eye in order to focus with the left eye. So now if you guys don't worry about it, I'm not winking at you anyway, But maybe some of you ladies, I might wink at you, but not with wait a second here. This is not coming out right. Now, I tell my wife I wink at her. I'll usually do it with my left eye, But if I do it with my right eye, I'm not winking at you. Just keep that in mind. Go back to sleep, Jesse. When you think about John Mark, what do you think about? Well, most likely, if you're the average member of the church, you think about a quitter, because that's what John Mark, at least in part of his life, was. But I think there's really a lot more to John Mark than just simply he was a quitter. And like Tony said last night, he was talking about Demas, and he talked about Demas and the fact that we don't have a record of Demas ever repenting. John Mark was different than that. He was a man that did repent, and we'll be looking at that here in just a little bit. But as we think about John Mark, really there's not a lot of information about him, but there's enough information that we can do, as Paul said in 1 Corinthians chapter 11, verse 1, "Be ye followers of me, even as I am of Christ," that we can be followers of John Mark in some way. Now, that's not to say that we ought to be and Jesse, this is for your benefit so you don't miss the point, that we can be followers of him, but not the followers of his quitting. But we can be followers of him as far as his repenting is concerned and the good life that he lived afterwards. But as we think about John Mark, and as we think about this idea of being a follower, the word is actually, we get our word mimic from that particular word, but mimic is not really a good word in the English, because in the idea of English, we think about someone making almost a mockery of someone else. And maybe the mime that, moves around and makes a mockery, but that's not the word that he uses there. But the word that he uses is really more the idea of being an imitator. We can take his example and we can imitate that example within our lives. And again, it's not the example of being a quitter, it's the example of other things that we learn about him. Well, as we think about John Mark, I want to begin with a little bit of background, and it takes us over to Acts, the 12th chapter, when we were first introduced to John Mark. Now, John Mark is his coming into the picture is directly after a great persecution that had risen against the Lord's church. Herod had taken James, the brother of John, the son of Zebedee, and had him killed. He had taken Peter also. And by taking Peter, he put him in jail, and he was hoping to kill Peter after the Passover. And again, this is almost one of those mockery type things that we saw with the life of Jesus in the previous hour. And they were going to kill him after the Passover, as if that really made any difference. I mean, if you're going to kill somebody good, when does it really make any difference whether it's before, after, or even during the Passover? It's a mockery, and it was a hypocrisy on their part. But the church, or some of those that were in the church, were praying for Peter. Now, I could just imagine different ones that would be praying for Peter. Some would probably be praying for his specific release. Others may be praying for his strength, that he might stand strong and bold while he's being persecuted, while he's in prison. But nonetheless, an angel of the Lord appears to Peter. He's actually chained between two guards. He's released. They're able to get out of the prison. The prison doors open. Obviously a very much of a miracle. And they go over to this lady's house whose name was Mary. And this Mary is the mother of John, whose surname was Mark. And thus John Mark. And he knocks on the door, or the gate actually. And Rhoda, the servant girl, comes to the gate, and she sees that it's Peter. She goes in, and I could just imagine, couldn't you? This has happened to me a couple of times. I think it happened when I went to Tupelo one time, Oklahoma, where Jesse Stevens preaches. And I knock on the door, and, Peter knocked on the gate, and Rhoda comes to the gate. She sees it's Peter. She runs in, tells the others. The others don't even believe her. But ultimately, they come to the gate and they let him in. And you could just imagine Peter's response, now what am I going to do? Where am I going to go? But he waited there and he was able to get in. Now that must have had at least somewhat of an impact upon John Mark's life. Not only do we find later on that John Mark goes on that first missionary journey, which is just in the next chapter and not very many years in advance of this. It isn't very long after that John Mark goes. But Peter also, in 1 Peter chapter 5 and verse 13, called John Mark his son in the faith. Well, he just said his son, but no doubt it'd be the son in the faith. And so it may have been on this particular occasion. And you could just imagine a young man seeing that miracle that had taken place, seeing the release of Peter and opening up to the gospel. Now, whether he was strengthened by that or whether he became a Christian as a result of it, nonetheless, Peter referred to him as his son. And it is the fact that it must have had a great impact upon him. So that's where the beginning of John Mark begins. But most people, again, we think about John Mark as being that quitter. Well, Paul and Barnabas, and really as we think about that at the beginning of the missionary journey, and we usually call it Paul's first missionary journey, but I think probably more apt is it was Barnabas's first missionary journey, and Saul of Tarsus went with him. But be that as it may, whether you think that or not, it doesn't really matter because it's just conjecture. I had to get that word in there. Had to make some fun of somebody. I mean, the students will tell you that, that's every day. But nonetheless, whether that's, was Barnabas's journey or Paul's journey, doesn't really matter. They decide that they're going to go on this first missionary journey. And the elders at Antioch of Syria, Antioch is in northern Syria. Antioch is on the Orontes River. And they then decided to go from Antioch down to Seleucia. And then they took a ship over to Salamis, which is over in Cyprus, and then on up into Asia Minor to Pergas and Pergama and different places like that. So anyway, they took that ship over there, and they start the work in that. And that's found over in Acts the 13th chapter. And let's look at verse 5 and verse 13, where we'll catch up with that story. He said, "And when they were at Salamis, they preached the word of God in the synagogues of the Jews, and they had also John to their minister." And then verse 13, "And when Paul and his company loosed from Paphos, they came to Perga and in Pamphylia, and John, departing from them, returned to Jerusalem." Now, there's really a number of different things that we really need to learn and that we can examine from this. The first of all, when I think about this, Paul and Barnabas taking John Mark with them, I think one of the things that we have to keep in mind that it wasn't just simply for a pleasure trip and for John Mark just simply to be there and enjoy the trip together with Paul and Barnabas. I'm quite confident that Paul and Barnabas had in mind that they were going to train this young man to do the work of the gospel. That they were going to take him on this journey in order for him to see their example and in order for them to give the instructions that they need to give in order for him to learn. Just exactly what Paul would say later on to Timothy, the young evangelist. And I think about it interestingly in the sense of Paul's last letter while on earth. And we have the dates right. It'd be in the fall of 68. And Paul is getting ready to depart. As Tony made mention, he said, "The time of my departure is at hand. I've fought a good fight. I've finished my course. I've kept the faith. Henceforth there is laid up for me a crown of righteousness, which the Lord, the righteous judge, shall give me, and not to me only, but unto all them that love his appearing." Paul was ready to give his life. And he understood that he was going to give his life. But Paul was concerned with the propagation of the gospel after he was dead. And so in the second chapter of that same book, and in verse 2, he says, "The things that thou hast heard of me among many witnesses, the same commit thou to faithful men, who shall be able to teach others also." That's what Paul had in mind. That's what Barnabas had in mind in bringing John Mark with him. Now, having done mission work in a number of different places, and the thing that John wrote or read is a little bit old. I actually sent another one, but nonetheless, it got read. But anyway, it's been 7 different places, and I don't know how many times I've taken young men with me. And sometimes young ladies, too, that have gone with a group with us or different places like that. And what we have in mind in taking them is not only sharing in the work, but for their advantage and for their education and for their discipline in learning how to do that. One of the great privileges that I've had is the trip to Jamaica last year. And Jeremy and I had been talking for a number of years to take, well, I call him Boulevard, but he wouldn't want me to call him that out loud. Oh, I just did, Boulevard. Sorry. JT is what he would really prefer to be called. But I have nicknames for all my grandchildren, and his nickname is Boulevard. I have nicknames for my kids too, and Jeremy, I usually call him Freddie, but sometimes I call him Dr. Cool. He told me never to call him Doctor, but I call him Dr. Cool. Okay. Enough of that sidetrack. So anyway, one of the privileges that I had was to take my son and grandson, and we talked about it quite a time before that. Where are we going to go? Now I do mission work in different places, obviously, and we talked about other places, but we came down really based upon the fact that in Jamaica they speak English, and we felt like there wouldn't be quite as much culture shock there, and we took JT with us down to there. But you know what I was looking forward to is not only preaching with him there and helping him learn how and to develop his talents as far as preaching is concerned, but also private Bible studies. And I just couldn't hardly wait to have a private Bible study with him. But you know, that's what I think about every time I take a young man with me. Sitting down to have a private Bible study and leading that person, and not just simply telling them what they need to do, but leading them to conclusions and helping them to reach the proper conclusion and to teach that young man that you're with, or that young lady sometimes, to teach them how to teach others. You see, that's what Paul and Barnabas was wanting to do, or were wanting to do. They were wanting to teach this young man, Barnabas, or young man John Mark, to have an opportunity to teach and preach with the gospel. Now, the text actually says that he was an attendant, or in the King James it says a minister. It said in verse 5 of chapter 13, it says, and they had also John their minister, or John their attendant, the American Standard. Well, that word attendant is kind of an interesting word. The literal translation of that word means under rower. Now, I'm talking about a rower like one who rows a boat. And so they are the person that rows that boat, an under rower. And the word developed from the Navy, and you could imagine at that time they would have these great ships, and these ships would have banks of oars, and they would stick out of those oars. Well, can you imagine trying in battle to manipulate that ship and to maneuver that ship, and not everybody being where they need to be? And so they had a seaman of some type, probably a leader of some kind, maybe a sergeant or something like that. And he would then call out a cadence, and they would pull those oars according to that cadence, so that everybody would move the oar just exactly the right time to maneuver that ship. Whether to maneuver it to avoid a missile of some type, or to maneuver that ship in order to shoot a missile. They would have to maneuver those ships, and they were under rowers. And so they would listen to the one that was in control, and they would subject themselves to that one that was in control, and they would move that ship. Sometimes you might even have a bank of rowers on each side of the ship. And sometimes you want to move straight ahead, and all those oarmen would have to pull those oars at the same time so that ship would move straight ahead. But sometimes you want it to move and turn very quickly. So you would have one side that would be pulling the oars the opposite way as the other, and they would turn that ship very easily and very quickly, maneuvering it around. Well, you see, that was the word that's used there that came to mean an attendant or a minister, one who serves. And they served then that seaman who would call out those orders. And John went there to be that servant, to be that under rower in that ship. Now, it wasn't just simply that John was supposed to go down to the local market and buy the Coca-Cola for the older men for them. But, and I'm sure some of that kind of thing, although they didn't have Coca-Cola and probably not a local market, but nonetheless, I'm sure some of that was a part of it. But the real purpose in taking John Mark was to train him with the gospel, that he could be an effective worker of the gospel of Jesus Christ. But, as we've already read, John Mark quit. Now, I don't know of any other way of saying it, that John Mark quit. Now, whenever someone quits, and if you've been a member of the church for very long, you know that happens. And some quit, and they just leave and go back into the world as if nothing has ever been different about their lives. But when they quit, they always leave a gap. You ever think about that? When the song leader gets his feelings hurt because somebody critiqued him, and maybe even from an honest standpoint, and yet when they quit, there's a gap that's left that somebody has to fill. When the preacher quits, and we've all known preachers that quit, they leave a gap, a hole, where somebody else has to fill that space. When that person that leads the assembly or that Bible class teacher quits, that leaves a gap. Now, we're not told about the gap that's left with John Mark, but no doubt there's a gap that's left. And that Paul and Barnabas would have had to pick up and gone from there, and no doubt would have had to do it without complaint. They just had to fill up that spot that John Mark left. And it hurts the work. No matter how much we think that it won't hurt, it hurts the work. But think with me for a moment this way too. Now, I don't know how much Barnabas and Paul had invested in John Mark in this traveling, but no doubt they would have had to invest something into it. Now, I don't know what it would have cost to go from Antioch of Syria over to Seleucia, but, it's only about 15 miles. Good possibility they walked over there anyway, and so maybe there wasn't anything involved in the transportation of that particular segment of their journey. But, if you're walking 15 miles, that means that it's going to take you about 5 hours of walking, which means then that we've got to be fed some way. Oh, now we've gotten to some investment that they had in John Mark. Then they catch that ship, and they've got an investment in there. They didn't travel for nothing. Sometimes they would jump a ship that would be a cargo ship, and oftentimes it was the case that they would do that, but it still cost them something to travel over there. And then they go to the island of Cyprus, and they work there, and there would have been a cost involved in that. And ultimately up to Asia Minor, and there would be a cost involved in that. But by John Mark quitting, it's like taking all that money and throwing it to the wind. They had an investment of money, an investment of time, an investment of effort, and all wasted in this man. Years and years ago, I was preaching in one place, and there was a little fuss that went on in the congregation. A couple of people resigned from this, that, and the other, and had no business. Some of them completely left. Most of them actually stayed, but they just didn't do anything after that. But one lady specifically, she was raised by parents who were Christians, and so she was raised in a godly home. She became a Christian at a very young in her life. And I don't remember, I know that she told me more than once, but how old she was, but somewhere around 10, maybe a little bit under, a little bit over. I just don't remember exactly how old she was when she became a Christian. She served the Lord most of her life, and she was in her 80s, and because of what had taken place, as far as I know, she never went back to the Lord's church. In fact, she would sit at home and she would do nothing. And she lost her soul over getting upset and being a quitter. Now, can you imagine spending 60 years of your life in service to the Master and get to the end of your life, or at least relatively to the end of your life, and giving it up because you've got angry over something? But it didn't happen that way with Paul and Barnabas. Yeah, John Mark quit, but Paul and Barnabas, they could have said, "Oh, well, I'm just going to give up too. I mean, John Mark has given up, so I'm going to just give up and quit and go back to my place too of residence." But John Mark, he quit. But Paul and Barnabas kept on working. They didn't let John Mark's quitting stop the work of the gospel. Well, ultimately, they go back to the city of Jerusalem, or actually back to Antioch. And after about a year's time in Antioch, and actually it's about 2 years after this all takes place, Paul and Barnabas decide that they're going to go on that second missionary journey. And they have very clear intent to go up to Asia Minor, where they had worked that first journey. And they were going to go up there, and they were going to establish the brethren there, not establish the church, but establish the brethren, strengthen the brethren, help them along, to give them some fortification, and that they were going to preach to those brethren and strengthen them. Well, Barnabas, he decides, hey, let's take John Mark. Now, I don't know how that conversation went. I suspect it probably didn't go very well. And, I mean, he might have said, I know that he quit the first time, and kind of, set it up for Paul. But Paul saw that he was a quitter. He did not want to take John Mark. But, there's really more to it than just that. It could be, and I think Barnabas was a good man, and I know that that's the case, that he was a good man, and he wanted to do what's right. And he saw maybe something in John Mark that maybe Paul didn't see. Because after all, they went a different way, but there must have been a strengthening of John Mark. And where did that come from? Well, the only logical conclusion is that Barnabas helped strengthen John Mark that he wouldn't be a quitter, and helped him to repent and change his life so he wouldn't be a quitter. But John Mark and Barnabas go one way. They go back to the island of Cyprus, and they work there. And Paul, he takes somebody else with him, and they go on that second missionary journey. He takes Silas with him. He goes up into Asia Minor. And it's interesting that he doesn't take the ship this time. He walks north, goes up to the Cilician Gate. We believe that most likely he stopped at the city of Tarsus, goes up to Asia Minor and to the cities of Iconium and Lystra and Derbe, and he preaches there in that church, in those churches. He strengthens the brethren there. He picks up the young evangelist Timothy. He goes on up to Troas because the Spirit forbids him to go anywhere else, and he receives the call of Macedonia. And then he goes up with Luke on up into Europe. And he works then in the area of what we call Macedonia and Greece at the present time. That's what we refer to them. Well, you see, it didn't stop the work. Paul and Barnabas continued to work in that first missionary journey. They came back. They decided they were going on that second missionary journey. And the fact is that sometimes those of us that are close with others, we have to split ways over opinions or conjecture. But it doesn't stop the work. And don't you find that interesting? That they were both dedicated to the work. Now, I know the text there says that the elders of Ephesus, or elders of Antioch of Syria, they put their hands on Paul and sent Barnabas away, or sent Paul and Silas away, and commending them to that work, or to that grace. But I believe the commendation there is a reference to Paul and Silas doing the work that they had intended to do on that second missionary journey. Not that they didn't commend Barnabas and John Mark. They would have encouraged that good work as well, but they were commending Paul and Silas then to do that work of that was determined on the first missionary journey. So the point is, though, that just because there's a quitter and it can influence us and it can cause us to wonder about different things, yet we're not to quit the work. And just because there's a dissension between us, the work cannot stop, nor can it be hindered from what we are called to do. Now, let's go back to our text there, and let's pick up a couple of more things, because there's more to the story of John Mark than just that. Because Paul would recognize that John Mark was a useful servant. Now let's look at a few more passages that indicate that. The first is over in the book of Colossians in chapter 4. Now in this particular section, verses 9 and following, he begins with this man named Onesimus. And Onesimus is an interesting character as well. Onesimus is a slave that Paul apparently converted, and he goes back to Philemon, who's a member of the church there. And many believe that Onesimus was the one that carried the letters of Colossians and the letter of Philemon to the various ones there in that. And he says, with Onesimus, a faithful, beloved brother, who is one of you, they shall make known unto you all things which are done here. And then later on, he says, Aristarchus, my fellow prisoner, salute you, and Marcus, sister's son to Barnabas, touching whom ye received commandment, if he come unto you, receive him. Second missionary journey, Paul says, we're not taking him. There had to be a change that took place in John Mark in between all this. And John Mark clearly had repented, and Paul recommended him to the work that he was done. And again, I think as we try to figure all these events out, who would have had a great impact upon John Mark in repenting and in changing his way and in becoming faithful? Well, it would have been Barnabas. And that's the only person that we know that would have had that influence. Barnabas must have seen something in John Mark that Paul could not see or did not see. But he encouraged John Mark. And he then became that faithful follower. And Paul recommended him. Over in Philemon and in verse 24, contrary to some of you young guys that only use computers, it's not Philemon chapter 1 and verse 24. It's Philemon 24. So I got to get that jab in there. I don't know, which one can I pick on? Andrew? So in verse 24 it says, Marcus, Aristarchus, Demas, and Lucas, my fellow laborers. Well, he referred then to John Mark as his fellow laborer. And that word's an interesting word. It comes from sun in the Greek, and that particular word means together. We get our word like, actually sun is a form of sum, and we get our word like summary from that particular thing, a summary of bringing it together and those kind of things. And then the other word is ergos, or ergio, or ergion, I think is this in this particular case. But we get words like ergonomic from this particular word. Anybody know what ergonomics is? This is an old word. Well, it's really not all that old, because several years ago they used to sell chairs that were ergonomically sound. And that meant they were a chair that you could work from, and that's what the word means. Ergonomic was an ergonomic chair that was one that you could work from a long time or for a long time. So that's where this word comes from. So you got the word work and the word together, and it's working together. And notice that Paul said, and this is concerning Mark, who was that quitter who had departed on that first journey. He said he was his fellow laborer, his fellow worker, his one who worked together with him. Paul recognized the character of John, and that character has changed. But then one more passage that really brings this out. Go over to the book of 2 Timothy, and this is the passage that is used with reference to Demas that we saw last night, but he also mentions John Mark there. With Demas, we have a sad, sad story. Departed, never returned. With John Mark, yes, he departed, but he returned. And listen to the words of verse 11 of that particular passage. He said, "Only Luke is with me. Take Mark and bring him with thee, for he is profitable to me for the ministry." Now notice what he's talking about here, and what Tony made mention of last night. Paul had come to the end of his life, and anybody that was associated with Paul, they were submitting themselves to possible persecution, to possible death. And he writes to Timothy, Demas had departed because obviously he loved this present life more than he loved the work of the gospel, and more than he loved the spiritual life that we have in Christ. And he departs. But he writes to Timothy, he says, "You bring my coat," and that's why we know it's probably in the fall, maybe late summer. It's 68 AD, or AD 68, and it's toward the end of his life. It's getting to be winter time, and he said, "Timothy," and if you really read between the lines, or put a little conjecture there, that he is saying, "Timothy, you come to me and submit yourself to possible persecution, possible imprisonment, and possible death." And he thought so highly of John Mark that he said, "You bring John Mark with you." Now, if you were Paul, and all you could remember was John Mark being a quitter, would you say, "Bring that quitter with me, I know he's going to quit"? That's not what you would think. You would think, John Mark has proven himself. He's a good man. He'll stand for the truth. He'll do the work. And notice what he said there in that particular passage. He said, "For he is profitable to me for the ministry, for the service." He knew what was going to happen to him, but he still called John Mark. And apparently John Mark had the courage, along with Timothy, to do that work. But you know, when I think about John Mark, there's one more thing that we have to mention. And I saved this to the end, but it's the greatest accomplishment of John Mark. A lot of times folks don't put this together. But John Mark was a prophet of God. Now, when did he become a prophet? I don't know when he became a prophet, but the text doesn't say that when he became a prophet. But I know that he was inspired. I know that only the apostles could pass on that miraculous gift by the laying on their hands. And so John Mark had to have the apostles' hands placed on them for him to do the work that he did. And the prophets of the first century, they were able to do many of the things that the apostles were doing as far as the miraculous different things. And we have different books within the New Testament that were not written by apostles, but were written by the prophets of the first century. And when you think about those prophets, they served the universal church. And what I mean by that, the church world over. It doesn't make any difference whether you're talking about the first century or the 21st century. It doesn't make any difference whether you're talking about Jerusalem or Independence, Missouri. You see, they served the church. And some of the things that they wrote is for all of our benefits, for every Christian's benefit. And so you look through the Bible and you look and you see, well, there's Luke. He's the Gentile, the only Gentile writer of the New Testament that we know of. He was a prophet of God. The apostles laid their hands upon him, and by inspiration he wrote those things down that we find in the book of Luke and the book of Acts. And then you have James, the brother Lord, who wrote the book of James, and Jude, the brother of the Lord, that wrote the book of Jude. And they were prophets of God. And John Mark was a prophet. And his greatest work was the gospel record of Mark that has influenced millions upon millions of people to receive the gospel of Jesus Christ and to obey it. And now, as Paul Harvey used to say, and now you know the rest of the story.